January 17, 1943, Schweinfurt, Bavaria. The factory floor trembles, not from the machinery, the ball-bearing presses have been silent for 3 minutes now, but from something else, something in the sky. Herr Director Klaus Hoffmann stands at the window of the Vereinigte Kugellager Fabriken plant, his breath fogging the glass as he strains to see upward through the industrial haze. The sound is wrong, not the familiar drone of individual bombers scattered across the heavens, but something synchronized, mathematical. A bass note that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself has developed a pulse. His assistant, Friedrich, joins him at the window, and together they watch as the clouds part. What emerges defies Klaus's understanding of aerial warfare. Not a scattered formation of opportunistic raiders, but a geometric precision that belongs in a Prussian parade ground, not 8,000 meters above Bavaria. 12 aircraft arranged in a perfect diamond, then another 12, then another. The formations stack upon one another like crystalline structures, each group maintaining exact intervals, their contrails drawing parallel lines across the winter sky with the regularity of ruled paper. Klaus counts 6 formations before he loses track, his mind refusing to process the mathematics of what hovers above his factory. The sound intensifies, not louder, but denser, as if the individual engine notes have merged into a single, sustained chord. In that moment, watching those formations hold their spacing with impossible accuracy through the buffeting winds of the upper atmosphere, Klaus Hoffmann understands that something fundamental has changed in this war. The Americans have brought order to chaos. What Klaus could not know, what none of the men watching from the factories and streets of Schweinfurt understood, was that those formations were not simply flying together, they were being watched, guided, coordinated by an invisible architecture of radio signals and ground stations that stretched from the English coast to the heart of Germany itself. The geometric perfection Klaus witnessed was not merely the result of skilled pilots, though skill played its role. It was the visible manifestation of a technological revolution that had quietly unfolded across the European theater, a network of control and communication that turned individual bombers into instruments of a single, directed will. The Germans had been fighting what they believed was an air war. They had not yet realized they were fighting a network. The evolution of strategic bombing had been, until this point in the war, a story of approximation. The British had learned in blood the impossibility of precision raids in daylight, their bombers torn from the sky by German fighters and flak with such regularity that Bomber Command had retreated into the relative safety of night. But darkness brought its own curse. Navigation became guesswork, targets became city-sized. Approximations, and the bombs fell wherever the winds and stars took them. The Americans, arriving in Britain with their theories of daylight precision bombing, had seemed almost naive to their British counterparts. The United States Army Air Forces insisted that their B-17 flying fortresses, bristling with machine guns and flying in tight formations, could defend themselves while striking specific industrial targets with unprecedented accuracy. The British, veterans of 2 years of brutal air combat, smiled politely and prepared to welcome their American cousins to reality. But reality, it turned out, had multiple faces. The early American raids of 1942 had been tentative affairs, small formations testing German defenses, learning the lethal geography of occupied Europe. The losses were significant, but not catastrophic, and more importantly, the Americans returned with data, reams of data, flight recorder readings, radio intercepts, pilot debriefings, gun camera footage, damage assessments. Where the British had learned through experience and adapted through necessity, the Americans approached the problem as engineers approach a malfunctioning machine. They measured, they analyzed, they iterated, and somewhere in the vast complexes of the Army Air Force's headquarters, In the minds of men who thought in frequencies and signal strengths rather than courage and determination, a solution began to take shape. The challenge was fundamental. How do you guide hundreds of aircraft, each piloted by a crew operating in conditions of extreme stress and danger, to converge on a single point in space and time with enough precision to overwhelm defenses and saturate a target? The traditional answer had been formation discipline, tight flying, visual reference to lead aircraft, predetermined routes memorized before takeoff. But this method suffered from cumulative error. Weather could scatter formations, combat could disrupt them. Navigation mistakes by lead crews could send entire wings off course. The Germans had learned to exploit these weaknesses, concentrating their fighters on lead aircraft, disrupting formations, forcing bombers to scatter and become vulnerable. What the Americans needed was not just discipline, but correction. Real-time adjustment, a way to guide their formations even as conditions changed, even as the careful plans made in Suffolk briefing rooms met the violent reality of German airspace. The network that emerged to solve this problem was called, in the dry language of military bureaucracy, the Ground-Controlled Interception System, though its application to bomber guidance was an adaptation its designers had not originally envisioned. The principle was elegant. A series of ground stations equipped with sophisticated radio direction finding equipment would track formations from takeoff to target and back, maintaining continuous communication with lead aircraft. These stations, scattered across eastern England and in some cases hidden in occupied territories held by resistance forces, could plot the precise position of bomber streams and relay corrections to formation leaders. More than that, they could coordinate multiple formations, stacking them in time and space to create the massive concentrated raids that would come to define American strategic bombing. The technology itself was an evolution of systems developed for fighter direction, the same principles that allowed British controllers to guide their Spitfires to intercept incoming German raids. But scaling this to bomber operations required innovation at every level. The radios had to be powerful enough to reach aircraft deep over Germany. The plotting tables had to track dozens of formations simultaneously. The controllers had to develop new languages, new procedures for guiding not individual aircraft, but geometric formations of 12, 18, 36 bombers moving as single units. And perhaps most critically, the pilots had to trust it. Trust voices coming through static-filled headsets, trust corrections that might seem to contradict their own instruments, trust a system that asked them to fly with mechanical precision through zones of lethal flak and fighter attack. The Germans, watching these formations appear with increasing frequency through late 1942 and into 1943, developed theories. Some Luftwaffe intelligence officers believed the Americans had perfected formation, flying to such a degree that they could maintain cohesion through instinct and training alone. Others suggested the Americans were using sophisticated onboard navigation systems, perhaps adaptations of the Norden bombsight, extended to provide continuous positioning. A few, the more paranoid or more perceptive depending on perspective, suspected radio guidance but dismissed it as impractical. The distances were too great, the interference too severe, the complexity too overwhelming for real-time application. What none of them fully grasped was the American capacity for systematic organization, the willingness to build vast infrastructures of coordination and control that seemed inefficient by European standards, but became overwhelming through sheer scale and persistence. Hauptmann Werner Backe, a fighter pilot with Jagdgeschwader 26, recorded his observations in a letter to his brother in February 1943, a letter that would be recovered decades later from family archives and published in a collection of Luftwaffe correspondence. "They fly like machines," he wrote, "not men. We attack the formations and they do not scatter as the British do. We shoot down the stragglers and the formation closes the gap, tightening as if drawn together by invisible wires. Yesterday we hit a formation over Wilhelmshaven, knocked 3 bombers out of the lead element within 2 minutes. The formation wavered, began to spread, as they always do when leadership is disrupted. But then, within 30 seconds, they reformed. A different aircraft moved forward, assumed the lead position, and the geometry restored itself. This is not flying. This is something else. It is as if they are being moved by a hand we cannot see. Werner's observation, filed away in intelligence reports and ultimately lost in the overwhelming volume of combat data the Luftwaffe processed daily, was more accurate than he knew. The formations were being moved by an invisible hand, or rather, by dozens of hands working in coordination. At RAF Bawdsey, at Stoke Holy Cross, at a dozen other stations scattered across the eastern counties, controllers sat before plotting tables watching the progress of bomber streams with an attention that bordered on meditation. They tracked the formations by radar and radio beacon, comparing actual positions to planned routes, calculating drift caused by winds aloft, noting delays or accelerations in the schedule. When deviations exceeded acceptable parameters, corrections went out by radio to formation leaders, transmitted in coded brevity codes developed specifically for this purpose. Red shift 2 minutes might mean the formation was 2 minutes behind schedule and needed to increase airspeed. Baker offset 7 left could indicate a navigation correction of 7 degrees port. The language was compressed, designed to minimize radio time and reduce the chances of German interception and decoding. But beyond the immediate tactical guidance, the network provided something more profound. It allowed the Army Air Forces to conduct bomber operations as truly coordinated campaigns rather than collections of individual raids. Multiple formations could be launched at staggered intervals, each guided to converge on their targets within minutes of one another, overwhelming German fighter defenses by sheer simultaneity. Diversionary raids could be coordinated with primary strikes, drawing German fighters away from the main target areas. Most critically, the network allowed formations that had been scattered by weather or combat to be guided to secondary targets or instructed to abort, reducing the instances of bombers wandering alone over hostile territory, vulnerable and lost. The men who flew the bombers understood they were receiving guidance, but few grasped the full extent of the system. To the pilot of a B-17 focused on maintaining his position in formation, monitoring his instruments, scanning for fighters, the guidance came as simply another voice in the headset, another piece of information to process in an environment already saturated with sensory input and mortal danger. Lieutenant James Harker, a pilot with the 91st Bomb Group, described the experience in his post-war memoir. We'd be droning along at 23,000 feet, throttles set, formation tight, and suddenly the radio would crackle, and you'd hear the controller's voice, calm as if he was ordering coffee, giving the lead ship a heading change. 2 degrees right, maintain altitude, and the whole formation would bank, subtle as a school of fish turning, and you'd follow because that's what you did. You didn't question where the instructions came from or how they knew where we were. It was just part of the machine, and we were parts of the machine too. This mechanization of aerial combat, this transformation of men and aircraft into components of a larger system, represented a peculiarly American approach to warfare. Where German doctrine emphasized individual initiative and the inspired leadership of battlefield commanders, and British practice evolved through pragmatic adaptation to immediate circumstances, the American military was building systems that could absorb massive casualties and continue functioning, systems that could be scaled to continental proportions, systems that reduced individual skill, while still important, to just one variable among many. The ground control network was not designed to create aces or celebrate heroism, though both existed in abundance among the bomber crews. It was designed to make heroism unnecessary, to replace individual courage with collective capability. The psychological impact on both sides was profound in ways that military historians would spend decades unpacking. For the Americans, the knowledge that they were being tracked, guided, watched over by forces on the ground provided a measure of comfort in the isolation of high-altitude combat. They were not alone, they were connected. Even as flak burst around them and German fighters made their passes, even as friends died in aircraft that one moment were flying in formation and the next were falling away in flames, there was a voice in the headset connecting them to England, to home, to a world where rationality still functioned. For some men this was crucial to maintaining sanity through the 25 or 35 mission tours that were required before they could go home. For others, it was simply background noise, one more technical element of a job that had to be done. For the Germans, the realization came more slowly and was correspondingly more disturbing. The Luftwaffe was built on a foundation of pilot skill and tactical flexibility. Their aces were celebrated, their kill counts recorded with meticulous care, their tactical innovations studied and disseminated. The idea that they were fighting not individual pilots but a system, that shooting down aircraft might not disrupt a formation because the system would simply route around the damage, was corrosive to the German understanding of aerial combat. It suggested that individual prowess, the quality that German military culture had elevated above all others, might be insufficient against an enemy who had industrialized coordination itself. Oberst Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled fighter commanders, would write in his post-war memoirs of the frustration of fighting the American bomber streams. "We could shoot them down. We did shoot them down in impressive numbers. But they kept coming. The formations would absorb our attacks, maintain their cohesion, proceed to their targets, and return to England. We were fighting not an air force but a process, and processes are difficult to kill with bullets and cannons." Galland's observation captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred. The ground control network had turned aerial warfare from a contest of individual combats into something closer to industrial production, where the output, bombs on target, was the product of systematic input rather than individual heroism. The network's effectiveness became undeniable during the brutal air battles of spring and summer 1943, when the Army Air Forces escalated its campaign against German industrial targets. The raids on Schweinfurt in August and October would become infamous for their casualty rates. 60 bombers lost on the August raid, 77 in October, losses that seemed to vindicate German claims that unescorted daylight bombing was suicidal. But within those disasters lay evidence of the network's value. Despite losses exceeding 20% of the attacking force, the formations that reached the targets maintained their cohesion and bombing accuracy. Subsequent analysis of German ball-bearing production showed measurable impact from the raids. The bombers had gotten through, had hit what they aimed at, had returned data on German defenses that would inform future operations. And crucially, the network had guided home the crippled bombers, the aircraft too damaged to maintain formation speed or altitude. Controllers would vector stragglers toward the coast, away from known flak concentrations, providing headings that offered the best chance of reaching England before fuel or damage forced a ditching. The number of crews saved by this guidance was never precisely calculated, but post-war interviews with survivors repeatedly referenced the controller's voice as a lifeline, the proof that someone knew where they were and was working to bring them home. The technological evolution continued through 1943 and 1944. New radar systems provided more accurate tracking. Radio equipment became more reliable and more powerful. The network expanded to cover greater range, eventually including stations in liberated France that could guide formations deeper into Germany with better precision. Jamming and counter-jamming measures evolved in the eternal technological race between offense and defense. But the fundamental principle remained constant: American bomber formations were not operating independently, but as elements of a coordinated system that extended from the ground to 30,000 feet, from England to the heart of the Reich. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts in early 1944, particularly the P-51 Mustang, capable of accompanying bombers to Berlin and back, would transform the air war and finally break the back of the Luftwaffe's day fighter force. But even with fighter protection, the ground control network remained essential. The coordination of bomber streams with fighter sweeps, the timing of attacks to maximize confusion and minimize exposure to enemy fighters, the ability to reroute formations based on real-time intelligence about German fighter dispositions, all of this depended on the infrastructure of communication and control that had been built across England. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Army Air Forces was conducting missions involving over 1,000 bombers, guided to their targets with a precision that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The network that tracked and guided them was now integrated with the broader Allied command structure, coordinating not just bomber operations but fighter sweeps, tactical air support, supply drops to resistance forces, and reconnaissance missions. It had evolved from an innovation to an institution, from an experiment to an assumption embedded in how the Allies conducted air warfare. German recognition of the network's existence came gradually through signals intelligence and the interrogation of captured air crews. By late 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence had pieced together enough information to understand the basic outline of the system, though they consistently underestimated its sophistication and reach. Attempts to jam the guidance frequencies had limited success. The Americans simply shifted to alternative frequencies, and the sheer number of ground stations made it impossible to suppress all communications. German night fighters, which had their own ground control system for intercepting British bombers, recognized in the American network a mirror of their own methods scaled to daylight operations and massive formations. There was, in the German response, a certain bitter irony. The Luftwaffe had pioneered ground-controlled interception for night fighting, had developed sophisticated radar and radio systems for guiding their fighters to British bombers. But they had never thought to apply these principles to guiding their own bomber formations, in part because their doctrine emphasized tactical flexibility, and in part because their industrial capacity was already stretched supporting existing systems. The Americans, arriving late to the air war, had observed what worked, adapted it to their needs, and implemented it with the industrial resources that allowed them to build systems the Germans could only theorize about. The symbolic weight of this cannot be understated. Here was American abundance and organizational capability made manifest in the sky, formations so large, so coordinated, so persistent that they represented not just military force but industrial and social systems capable of sustaining such force indefinitely. Every time a formation appeared over Germany, guided to its target with mechanical precision, it broadcast a message about relative capability that transcended the immediate military impact. The Germans could shoot down bombers, but they could not disrupt the system that produced the bombers, trained the crews, coordinated the raids, and would send more tomorrow and the day after, and the day after that. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a radio operator on a B-17 named Liberty Bell, wrote in his diary about a mission to Frankfurt in January 1944, "Got hit bad over the target. Number 3 engine gone. Number 4 running rough. Hydraulics leaking. Pilot called for emergency descent, and we dropped out of formation, losing altitude fast. I thought we were done, alone over Germany, damaged, sitting ducks for any fighter that found us. But then the radio crackled, and it was ground control, calm as Sunday morning. Bell, we have your position. Come left to heading 270. Descend to Angels 12. We're clearing a path." And they did. Guided us around the flak zones, kept us updated on fighter positions, talked us across the channel when we weren't sure we'd make it. Landed at the first field we saw in England with about 5 minutes of fuel left. The voice on the radio saved our lives, all 10 of us. We never saw the controller, never knew his name, but he knew exactly where we were and exactly how to get us home. Stories like Robert's multiplied throughout 1944 and into 1945, creating a mythology around the ground controllers that was distinct from but related to the mythology surrounding the bomber crews themselves. The controllers were the guardian angels, the invisible watchers, the voices of rationality and safety in an irrational and lethal environment. That most of them were young officers and enlisted men sitting in concrete bunkers, staring at plotting tables, drinking bad coffee, and fighting exhaustion during raids that could last 8 or 10 hours, somehow made their role more rather than less impressive. They were not flying into danger, but were intimately connected to those who did, tracking each formation with a focus that bordered on identification, feeling each loss as personal failure, even as they maintained the professional detachment necessary to keep functioning. The German public, increasingly subjected to daylight raids of overwhelming scale and precision, developed their own interpretations of what they witnessed. Some saw in the American formations evidence of national character. The Americans were mechanistic, inartistic, preferring brute force and system over skill and inspiration. This interpretation, comfortable to German cultural assumptions about American materialism, missed the profound innovation in how the Americans had organized aerial warfare. Others, particularly those in the technical and scientific communities, recognized the achievement for what it was and understood its implications for the war's outcome. If the Americans could coordinate bomber operations with this level of precision, what else might they achieve with the same systematic approach? As 1944 progressed and the air campaign intensified, the ground control network became simultaneously more sophisticated and more routine. New technologies were integrated, improved radar, better radio encryption, data links that could transmit targeting information directly to bombardiers. The procedures became standardized, taught to new controllers and bomber crews as established doctrine rather than experimental technique. What had been innovation became infrastructure, and infrastructure, once established, faded into invisibility. The bombers kept flying, the formations kept their geometry, the targets kept receiving their appointed tonnage of high explosives, and the network that made it all possible became simply the way things worked. The symbolism of the network extended beyond its military function to represent a broader American approach to complex problems. Where traditional military forces were organized around human relationships, command hierarchy, unit cohesion, personal loyalty, the American military was increasingly organized around information systems. The ground control network was communications technology, but it was also organizational technology, a way of structuring human activity to achieve goals that individual capability could not reach. This approach would extend far beyond the air war, would become foundational to how the United States military operated in every theater, and would eventually influence civilian organization in the post-war world. The bomber crews themselves, those who survived their tours and returned to the United States, carried with them memories of the voice in the headset, the calm instructions that came through static and fear to guide them home. In reunions and memoirs, in the quiet conversations of old men recalling youth, the ground controllers occupy a specific place. Not quite comrades, since they never shared the physical danger, but not distant command either. They were partners in a particular kind of way, connected by technology to share an experience that remained fundamentally different for each. The controller knew where you were, but could not know what you were experiencing. The aircrew heard the controller's voice, but could not see the plotting table, the tracks of friendly and enemy aircraft, the decisions being made to route one formation slightly left while another held course. By the war's end, The Army Air Forces had conducted over 300,000 bomber sorties from British bases, dropping nearly 700,000 tons of bombs on German targets. The loss rate, while horrifying in absolute numbers, over 12,000 bombers lost to all causes, was lower than it might have been without the coordination and guidance the ground control network provided. More significantly, the network had enabled the air campaign to function as a campaign, a sustained and coordinated application of force rather than a collection of individual raids. This coordination was what ultimately made strategic bombing effective, allowing the cumulative impact of raids to overwhelm German repair and dispersal efforts. The Germans, facing defeat on all fronts by early 1945, conducted their own assessments of why the air war had turned so decisively against them. Technical reports noted the role of Allied technological advantages, particularly in radar and radio equipment. Tactical analyses discussed the impact of long-range fighters and the increasing skill of Allied bomber crews. But some observers, particularly those analyzing the operational level of war, identified the Allied command and control infrastructure as perhaps the decisive factor. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, in interrogations following Germany's surrender, observed that Germany had fought the war as it understood war to be, a contest of will, skill, and courage. The Allies, particularly the Americans, had transformed war into something else, a problem of coordination and resource allocation that could be solved with sufficient organization and industrial capacity. There is poetry in the fact that one of the war's most significant innovations left almost no physical trace. The ground stations were eventually dismantled or converted to other uses. The radio transmissions faded into static as soon as they were sent. The plotting tables were cleared at the end of each mission. What remained was memory and documentation, and the changed understanding of what was possible. The network proved that aerial warfare could be coordinated in real time across continental distances, that hundreds of aircraft could be guided to converge on targets with precision, that the chaos of combat could be shaped by voices transmitted through the ether. In the decades that followed, as historians reconstructed the air war and veterans aged into reflection, the ground control network received recognition as one of the quiet innovations that shifted the balance. It appeared in official histories and academic studies, in documentaries and museum exhibits, but its significance went beyond the specific application to World War II bomber operations. It demonstrated a principle of modern warfare, that information and coordination could be as decisive as firepower and courage. The network was an early example of what would later be called command and control systems, precursor to the sophisticated digital networks that would characterize late 20th and 21st century military operations. For the men who flew through German skies in the years 1942 through 1945, the network was less abstract. It was the voice in the headset when you were alone and damaged over enemy territory. It was the corrections that kept formations together when clouds obscured visual reference. It was the knowledge, perhaps more psychological than tactical, that you were not operating in isolation but as part of a larger enterprise that had the resources and will to track your position and guide your return. In an environment where death could arrive in a fraction of a second, where friends disappeared into fire and wreckage with no warning or farewell, the network represented order and rationality and the possibility of survival. The German soldiers watching from below, the fighter pilots attacking from all angles, the flak gunners tracking their targets across the sky, they understood only what they could see: the formations, the bombs falling with terrible accuracy, the persistence and scale of the assault. What they could not see was the architecture of communication and control that made those formations possible, that coordinated their movements, that represented a kind of warfare their tradition had not prepared them to fight. They saw the bombers and believed they were fighting aircraft and crews. They were actually fighting a system, and systems built on abundance and organization, and the patient application of technical innovation proved difficult to defeat with courage alone. The war ended. The bombers stopped flying their formations over Germany. The ground stations fell silent or shifted to peacetime frequencies. The controllers returned to civilian life, carrying classified knowledge of systems that would remain secret for years. The bomber crews tried to resume lives interrupted by war, haunted by memories of friends lost, and missions flown, and the sustained terror of combat at altitude. And over time, as the urgency of war faded into history, the innovations that had seemed so vital became footnotes, technical details in the broader narrative of conflict and victory. But the principle remained. The idea that complex operations could be coordinated in real time across vast distances through networks of communication and control. That individual actors, whether aircraft or people, could be organized into systems that achieved outcomes beyond the sum of their parts. That warfare, like so much else in the modern world, was ultimately about information, its collection, transmission, interpretation, and application. The ground control network that guided American bombers over Germany was an early manifestation of this principle, built with the technologies available in the 1940s, but pointing toward futures where networks would become ubiquitous and invisible. So when Klaus Hoffmann stood at his factory window that January day in 1943, watching formations cross the sky with geometric precision, he was witnessing not just a bombing raid, but a transformation in how humans organize coordinated action. The bombers were the visible element, the physical manifestation of force. But behind them, invisible and essential, was the network. The voices and signals, the plotting tables and radar screens, the patient work of controllers guiding their charges through danger and home again. All of it built on a particularly American faith that complex problems could be solved through system and organization, that abundance of resources could be transformed into superiority of coordination, that the chaos of war could be shaped, if never eliminated, by the careful application of technology and procedure. The formations flew on, holding their positions, following their vectors, delivering their bombs, returning to England. And in the headsets, steady through the static, came the voice of control, calm, professional, connected across the distance by invisible threads of electromagnetic radiation, guiding home those who could be guided, marking the losses of those who could not. Preparing for tomorrow's mission and the missions after that, for as long as war required. This was the hidden story of the bomber offensive, not the visible courage of men flying into flak and fighters, though that was real and deserves its place in memory, but the invisible architecture that made their missions possible. The network they never fully saw, but which saw them always, tracking their progress across hostile skies, guiding them toward targets and home again, transforming individual aircraft into instruments of coordinated force. It was American warfare made manifest, systematic, persistent, overwhelming not through individual brilliance, but through the patient organization of collective capability, and it changed everything.